Well, this is certainly intimidating. Maybe a little less than if I were on stage in front of you all, but it's certainly something a bit new for me. So, introductions first, I suppose. First, I am directing this conversation at parents and caregivers, but I also want to use it to introduce autistic people watching this to the topic, because I went 33 years without ever really knowing it could exist for me. My name is Derek Burrow. I am 35, and I work for the Ottawa Hospital as the administrator for our learning management system. I am a librarian, with a master's in information from the University of Toronto. And on top of that, I also work as a technical writer for the Dutch assistive technology company, Assistiveware, and wrote the help and support documentation for their communication apps, Proloquo for Text, the latest version of Proloquo 2 Go, and the recently released Simpod. I am autistic. I paused over how to say that. I was tempted to say also autistic, as if it were some sort of big revelation, or something secondary to me. But it is neither. It is a fact and an integral part of who I am. My case is a bit complicated because it is mired in some very old school thinking and poor record keeping. I want to give a little history on myself so you can get an idea where I am coming from, but the big thing I want to talk to you about today is AAC, Augmentative and Alternative Communication. I am honestly shocked at how few people know that AAC is an option, and that it expands far beyond the absolute minimum offered PECs. There are also a lot of misconceptions about AAC, around who is eligible to use it, who can it help, etc. With that in mind, I will also be briefly introducing a variety of other AAC systems, both high and low tech, with an eye towards making sure that the autistic person involved is communicating in a way most comfortable for them. But what is AAC? Well, AAC is any form of communicating that isn't using your mouth for speech. While most people think of high-tech devices like the one I use, or a podbook which features pages of symbols, or a letterboard, there are far more options. Sign language is AAC. In fact, it's the most common and popular form of AAC in the world, with a diversity of languages and cultures which change from country to country. But I want you to think of all the ways you communicate other than with your mouth every day. You send emails, you text, you send instant messages, tweets, Facebook posts, pictures, GIFs, funny videos. If the intent is to communicate something, then it is communicate. Legitimate, respected communication. At this point, some of you probably are starting to tune out, because you are here to learn how to help your kids, and I seem pretty far from that. Well, to be fair, I am, but bear with me, because there is something you really need to hear. Yes. I am absolutely different from your kids, and from the people you work with. A large part of that is that I am an adult in their mid-30s. I have been living with this brain for a long time, and that's led me to figure out ways to do things. I had a lot of help learning some of those things, and to learn ways of dealing with them. Some of that hasn't been super healthy, because some of it meant fighting the way my brain works. However, none of that changes the fact that I am autistic. That the world is constantly too loud and too bright. It doesn't change the horrible levels of social anxiety I feel, or how small changes in routine can bring my brain to a screeching halt. It doesn't change that if I expect something to happen, and something different occurs, that my mind just sinks into a great fog of confusion where nothing really makes sense. Everyone's disability is different, and everyone will progress and develop differently. Just because an autistic adult doesn't look like they're having a lot of trouble, or need a lot of supports, doesn't mean that they have always been like that, or always will be like that, or are even like that any moment, but the one you meet them in. I am an AAC user, but I haven't always been one. I have always had issues with speech that weren't always noticeable. I would have times when it felt like there was a void between my mouth and my brain, and the words wouldn't come out. Or they wouldn't come out right, and the words I wanted wouldn't come out, and I would have to talk around those words to say something else. Speech was exhausting. I do it anyway, because I loved being able to share my thoughts with people. I didn't talk till I was 3 when I was a kid, and had speech therapy till I was 10. I never lost the enthusiasm for wanting to share my thoughts and passions with others, but speech was a poor tool for it. Over the last 5 or 8 years I have had a level of autistic burnout which I would term very bad. My work and life situations were in a very bad place and just kept getting worse. I moved away from all my friends to the other side of the country and I felt like my brain was falling apart. I had had burnouts before, but this was the worst, and it had been ongoing for years with no real chance to recover. Autistic burnout is very real, and one of the things it does is destroy all of those hard-earned coping skills and self-regulation tricks you spent decades learning. The stress and frustration and anxiety are like trying to think through molasses and sharp wires. And one thing it did to me was started making speech harder. I stopped being able to speak in a neurotypical way, and was finding more and more that I was fighting with every word. My coworkers thought I was on drugs. When a friend online mentioned that they used AAC during anxiety attacks, it was like throwing a life preserver to someone who was drowning. I had always found typing easier than talking. I had been communicating with my family almost entirely via text message for years, and chatted best with many of my friends via instant message. Typing took far less spoons. About 2 years I started using AAC instead of speech. Which sounds weird, I know, but it's surprisingly not unknown among autistics who find AAC as adults. It fills a perfect niche for me that has let me organize my thoughts and communicate in a far more comfortable, natural, and expressive way than before. AAC let me give voice to things that were inside me for years that I could never express verbally. It let me ask for the help I needed, a thing I would always freeze up or melt down asking for in the past. And it helped me better communicate my skills, both before and during a job interview which landed me my current position. This is huge because I have always had so much trouble with job interviews, so much trouble explaining my skills beyond the most basic and really applying what I know. But here I am, working in a job that I love and that I am genuinely good at. How did I get here? I didn't change. My skill set didn't change. My work experience didn't change. The only thing that changed was how I communicate. And again, this isn't unusual. As high-tech AAC becomes more and more accessible and lower in cost, or outright free, many autistic teens and adults who never had access to these technologies as children are finding them. I am not blaming anyone. The device I use now literally wasn't invented until the last decade. But I am hardly the only person with issues with speech who learned to mask and hide their problems. In many cases, in most cases really, if a child is seen as having functional speech, AAC is never even introduced. This is a problem because AAC can benefit autistics, both speaking and non-speaking. People need to understand that, like autism itself, verbal speech exists on a spectrum. And that spectrum can change, not only based on circumstance but also with time. We all need to be able to communicate in a way that is comfortable for us, and through which we can be best understood. Many autistics only use AAC sometimes, but it is very helpful for them in meltdowns, when they are tired, or stressed, or just when it is easier to type or use symbols than it is to speak with their mouth. It is thus important to not see AAC as a proof of failure, or that the person has given up. Instead, it should be seen as an equal, valid, and powerful tool which they can use to augment their own communication. Some will use it more than others. I found it preferable to use over speech, but other people use it only a few times a month. AAC is not a barrier to success. DJ Zavarazi, an autistic man who requires a great deal of support in his non-speaking, recently won a Peabody Award for his documentary. Non-speaking autistics like Ido Keeler and Amy Sequenzia are authors and powerful advocates. There are part-time AAC users like Alyssa Hillary, who is PhD candidate, who are also making huge strides while using AAC in the workplace and in an academic setting. The largest barrier to AAC use remains people's attitudes towards it. Children internalize that they are lesser if they use AAC instead of speech. Adults are infantilized, and it is often treated as being inferior. AAC is only a barrier if people treat it like a barrier, assume it to be limiting. Certainly, levels of communication and skill in communicating will vary. We are all different, and that also means that we have different levels of cognitive impairment and different desires to communicate. But when AAC is treated as valid, and the input of AAC users is understood to be important and equal, massive roadblocks to success are removed. This is the essence of communication choice, which says that we should respect however people communicate, and that people should be able to communicate in the ways which are best for them. Not all systems will work for all people, but there are some systems that are likely to work better, and other systems that work less well. People need to be given vocabulary to say things beyond just requesting, and if all you do is give someone a limited requesting vocabulary, then all they can do is request. It's a vicious circle that ultimately leads to frustration, meltdowns, and just giving up on trying to communicate because nobody seems to be listening. But this also takes work. It means working to teach children AAC when they need it, while also letting them guide their communication journey. And it means finding ways to make communication something fun, rather than something regimented, a chore. It means being a good communication partner, and modeling AAC communication. It means having conversations at the AAC user's level, and presuming their competence. The presumption of competence plays a big part in this. The assumption that, yes, the person is listening and does understand, they may just not show it. Or they may not be interested in communicating right now. This is a big part of communication choice, that for all I can choose how I communicate, I can also choose not to communicate, and that should be respected. The presumption of competence has allowed for major leaps forward with AAC access, and we are seeing more and more non-speaking autistics go to university, have careers, and be able to advocate for themselves. This only works if autistics are provided with the tools to fully communicate their thoughts. If the only symbols I have access to are yes, no, good, bad, bathroom, food, then I can't say a whole lot. If you only give someone the ability to request a cookie, they can request a cookie, they can't tell you what is their favorite kind of cookie, why they like it, or if they want to learn how to bake cookies themselves. Presume competence. Respect what is being said when it is done through AAC. Non-speaking autistics understand far more than you think, and in many cases have shown to understand just as much as their autistic peers. Understand that the autistic body doesn't always do what we want it to do, and that many forms of testing are not designed with consideration to the autistic mind and body. I know kids who were classed as being severely intellectually disabled, who just couldn't engage with the tests provided, because the test required verbal input from a mouth that couldn't make words, or pointing from fingers that didn't want to obey. Onto the meat. AAC options. AAC can be very broadly divided into 3 categories. No tech. No tech AAC requires no technology and can involve things like sign language, pointing, and understanding that behavior itself is communication. It's important to note that most sign languages are not one-to-one direct translations of a language into gestures. They are their own languages, with their own vocabulary, grammar, and cultures surrounding them. Light-tech AAC can be things like PECs, where pictures are exchanged. It is good for requesting and not for a lot else. I'm going to be honest, I think that PECs is speaking down to many AAC users. Pod is another option. Pod books are printed books, often 50 or 60 pages long, if not more, full of symbols. They are interconnected so that many symbols create the option for larger sentences, and have seen some real success. There are also letter boards which allow words to be spelled out one letter at a time, and can come in many different designs. If you have ever seen the TV show, Speechless, the main character JJ uses a letter board and a laser pointer. Some are like that, others are simpler. High-tech AAC uses devices like iPads, computers, smartphones, or dedicated tablets to run apps, which range from very basic, free text-to-speech, to complicated systems of thousands of symbols divided into screens. There are a lot of different options there, and many are highly customizable for each user. They also allow an AAC user to have their own voice and communicate fully independently. There are different advantages and disadvantages to each. Light tech tends to be more immediately portable and cheaper. High tech often allows for a greater breadth of expression, but is also more expensive and relies on batteries, can get damaged, etc. There is definitely a lot of pros and cons to weigh. Finding AAC systems can be difficult. Speech-language pathologists can be a huge help there, but can be difficult to access, especially for autistic adults who want to use AAC to help supplement speech. I have found the autistic community incredibly helpful for this. Honestly, fellow autistics who understood what I was going through helped steer me towards the apps that I use today and found most helpful. The first of these is a Facebook group called Ask Me, I am an AAC user. It prioritizes AAC users answering questions, and has a lot of really helpful information there. Another resource is to go the sites of AAC companies like Assistiveware and Toby. They often have a lot of really helpful resources, both in terms of their products and talking about AAC use in general. Autistic self-advocacy groups like A4A in Ontario, or ASN or the Autistic Women's Network in the United States, are also very helpful because they often have members who are AAC users and access to education resources. The really important thing here is that we want to share our experiences to help other autistics, and to advocate for the rights and voices of our autistic peers. YouTube provides videos of many AAC systems in action, whether they are simplified Max and sign language, or a podbook, or an AAC app. This can also help identify what works for different people with similar communication challenges. Finally, there is an online conference each year called AAC in the Cloud. This is a phenomenal resource, as it is presented entirely online, and the videos are kept available afterwards for those who could not attend. It features presentations for AAC users, speech-language pathologists, parents, and assistive technology specialists. There is a lot that can be learned from these presentations, and many focus on introductions to AAC and strategies surrounding it. I am, to be fair, really only scratching the surface of the larger topic of AAC use here. My intention was to introduce people to the subject, and also lobby hard for the presumption of competence and respecting communication choice. I'll take some questions now. Thanks for having me.